If shame is supposed to stop wrongdoing, why does it so often increase the very behaviors we regret? That question isn't rhetorical. It points to a pattern many people recognize, but rarely analyze. You make a mistake, a moral slip, a relapse. Into a habit, a harsh word, a broken commitment, instead of correcting the cause. You spiral. You judge yourself. You feel emotional pain. You seek escape. You get a brief sense of relief, and then the shame returns stronger than before. In simple terms, the shame loop looks like this: trigger self-judgment, emotional pain avoidance, or compulsion, temporary relief, deeper shame. The central thesis of this lecture is that, in Ibn Arabi's framework, Istighfar is not mere apology. It is a cognitive spiritual operation, a disciplined way of dissolving the false identity he claims that shame depends on. So here's the plan. We'll approach this like a seminar first: modern psychology and cognitive science on shame loops. Second, Ibn Arabi's conceptual tools for understanding identity and return. Third, a practical protocol that maps onto contemporary research on emotional regulation and attention. Shame loops are not new, but they are amplified by modern conditions. High social comparison, especially through digital metrics, creates constant evaluation. Chronic stress reduces cognitive flexibility. Fragmented attention makes sustained self-regulation harder and moral. Perfectionism, which often masquerades as piety or high standards, turns minor errors into existential verdicts. A useful clinical distinction here is guilt versus shame. Guilt is behavior-focused. I did something wrong. It often motivates repair. Shame is identity-focused. I am wrong. It typically motivates hiding. In cognitive science terms, shame becomes self-sustaining because it recruits several well-known mechanisms. First, attention bias. Once the mind concludes I'm defective, it selectively searches memory and perception for confirming evidence. You replay the past. You reinterpret neutral events as judgments. You filter your identity through your worst moments. Second, rumination. Repetitive self-referential thinking that doesn't resolve into action. This has been associated in research literature with over-engagement of the brain's default mode network, loosely. The system involved in self-referential narrative and mental time travel. Third, avoidance learning. Shame hurts, so you avoid the pain through distraction, numbing, secrecy, or compulsive behavior. The key point is that avoidance provides temporary relief, and that relief reinforces the avoidance. In behavioral terms, it's negative reinforcement. The action persists because it removes discomfort. From a neuroscientific perspective, carefully stated thread states reduce reflective capacity. When you experience intense self-criticism, your mind behaves as if under internal threat. Defensive. Cognition increases and problem-solving narrows. That's why two common strategies often fail. Denial, it's fine, nothing happened, and self-punishment, I must hate myself to change. Both preserve the loop. Denial blocks learning. Punishment blocks agency. This is where Ibn Arabi becomes unexpectedly useful. He is often introduced as a mystic, and that's true, but he is also a systematic metaphysician and psychologist of the soul, someone intensely interested in how consciousness constructs meaning, how intention shapes action, and how the divine names structure human experience. When I say Sufi-inspired here, I'm not implying miracles or vagueness. I mean a disciplined model of mind and transformation using concepts like tawba, return, Dhikr, remembrance, and divine names as functional categories, tools for attention, identity, and ethical repair. So we'll translate Ibn Arabi into modern terms where possible. Identity formation, self-models, emotional regulation, and behavioral change, not to reduce his thought, but to make it operational so you can understand. How Istighfar might dismantle the shame loop at its root. Istighfar as identity recalibration, not self-condemnation with the conceptual definition. Istighfar is commonly understood as seeking forgiveness, often translated as asking God to forgive you. But, in Ibn Arabi's logic, it also functions as realigning. Perception is a way of refusing to treat your mistake as your essence. The shame loop depends on a subtle move. The ego turns an act into an identity. A moment becomes a verdict. I lied becomes I am. A liar, I fell into a habit, becomes I am corrupt. In philosophical terms, this is a category error. You treat a contingent state as an essential reality. Ibn Arabi undermines that mistake at the level of ontology. The human self is not a fixed substance. It is contingent, shifting, and not self-sufficient. It must be understood in relation to the real al-Haqq. In simpler terms, you are not a sealed object whose worst act defines your being. You are a changing locus of states, intentions, and returns. In psychological terms, this resembles cognitive reappraisal. Changing the interpretation of an event changes the emotion and the downstream behavior. It also resembles decentering or metacognitive awareness in mindfulness research, seeing thoughts such as I'm disgusting as mental events rather than facts. Consider a concrete example. Someone relapses into a habit of anger, pornography, gossip, dishonesty. Shame says, "You're a hypocrite. This is who you are." That produces hiding, which increases the likelihood of repeating the behavior. Istighfar reframes. I performed an act misaligned with my values. I can return. That single shift preserves agency. It keeps the moral standard without collapsing. The self into condemnation, distinguishing shame from ʿArabi. Pathological shame collapses the self into defect. It says, I am unworthy. It pushes you towards secrecy, dissociation, and all-or-nothing thinking. ʿArabi, by contrast, is moral attentiveness, an orientation of respect and restraint. It's not identity, annihilation. It's closer to a calibrated moral sensitivity. Here's a practical test consistent with Ibn Arabi's logic. A healthy moral response should increase clarity and return, not produce paralysis and hiding. If an emotion drives you away from repair, away from apology, restitution, or improved discipline, it is not functioning as guidance. It is functioning as a veil. In modern psychological language, ʿArabi aligns more with adaptive guilt and prosocial motivation. It supports correction, toxic shame, aligns more with avoidant coping compared to inner dialogue's ʿArabi. I violated my standard. I'll correct it and guard my attention next time. Shame. I'm unworthy. I should hide. Nothing will change. Istighfar is the pivot that transforms moral discomfort into action. It takes the energy of this matters and turns it into a return rather than a collapse. Divine names as psychological attractors. Al-Ghaffar and At-Tawwāb we move into. A distinctly Ibn Arabi idea, but we can state it rationally. For him, the divine names are not only theological labels, they are modes of understanding reality that shape the self's inner narrative. They function like conceptual attractors organizing principles that pull perception and behavior into certain patterns. Two names matter here. Al-Ghaffar, the oft-forgiving, the one who covers At-Tawwāb, the ever-returning, the one who enables return. Shame. Loops are sustained by an implicit prediction. If I face this honestly, I will be rejected by God, by people, by myself. That prediction makes confession and repair feel unsafe. Istighfar, anchored in these names, builds a competing prediction. Return is possible and meaningful. And when threat perception drops, emotional regulation tends to improve. Executive. Function, planning, inhibiting impulses. Choosing long-term values becomes more accessible. A simple application. After wrongdoing, instead of spiraling into self-interrogation, you anchor. Return is part of the path. Then you take one concrete repair step, an apology, restitution, or a boundary that reduces future risk. Notice the structure. You are not excusing the act. You are refusing the shame-based forecast of permanent rejection. Dhikr and Istighfar as attention training against rumination from a cognitive science frame. Rumination is sustained attention stuck on self-narrative without resolution. Ibn Arabi's tradition treats Dhikr as attention training, reorienting awareness away from the egoic self-model and toward a larger reference point. Again, al-Ḥayāqq, q.s, tigh, far. Within Dhikr becomes a structured interruption. You replace the looping narrative with a calibrated return statement. This is not magical chanting. It's attentional and semantic discipline. Two micro-mechanisms matter. First, brief phrase repetition can serve as attentional anchoring, reducing mind-wandering. Second, it can function like affect labeling. I have erred and I return. Research on affect labeling suggests that putting emotion into clear language can reduce its intensity and create psychological distance. Example: your mind replays a mistake at night. Instead of arguing with the replay, you run a short sequence. Notice the loop, name the feeling, practice Istighfar with attention, slow the breath, then choose one corrective action for tomorrow. It's structured, finite, and action-oriented, exactly what rumination is not. Two paradoxes are worth clarifying. First, if God is forgiving, why feel remorse at all? In Ibn Arabi's logic, forgiveness does not erase responsibility. It restores relationships and clarity, so repair can occur. Remorse is useful when it is informational, a signal of misalignment. It becomes destructive when it turns into identity. Judgment. Second, does Istighfar become spiritual bypassing just words? It can, if it's reduced to verbal repetition without intention. In this model, Istighfar is valid when paired with Niger intention and action. Awareness, return, behavioral correction, restitution when needed. So Istighfar is not self-acceptance without standards. It is standard with hope, and psychologically, Hope is not sentimentality. Hope is a motivational structure. It keeps effort online. Harsh self-punishment often produces either collapse or rebellion. The deeper philosophical point is this: shame claims, my self-definition is final. Ibn Arabi undermines that claim because the self is not fixed. It is a dynamic locus of states. Therefore, return is not only morally good, it is ontologically coherent. Let's translate this into an actionable protocol that is a non-mystical. Step 1. Identify the loop. Describe what happened in behavior terms, not identity terms. I lied rather than I'm a liar. This mirrors CBT practice. Separate behavior from global self-condemnation. Step 2. Name the effect and body signal. I feel ashamed. Tightness in the chest. This supports emotional regulation through interoceptive awareness and reduces cognitive fusion being merged with the thought. Step 3. Istighfar as a cognitive reset. Repeat slowly with attention, not as magical words, but as meaningful reorientation. I acknowledge error. I seek covering, I return. Pair it with a steady exhale to downshift arousal. Step 4. Choose one repair action. Apology, restitution, a boundary, deleting a trigger, or writing a plan. This breaks avoidance learning. Action replaces hiding. Step 5. Close with a values statement. My aim is integrity. Return is my method. This consolidates identity around values, not around the mistake. 2 scenarios make it concrete. If you snap at family, istighfar, then apologize, then plan a pause strategy like stepping away for 60 seconds when arousal rises. If you relapse privately, istighfar, remove immediate triggers. Commit to a small replacement routine and consider accountability. The point is not perfection. It's interrupting the shame avoidance cycle. A guardrail. If shame is severe, chronic, or trauma-linked, combine spiritual practice with professional support. Istighfar can complement therapy, but it is not a substitute for clinical care. Let's compress the argument. Shame loops persist when error becomes identity. Ibn Arabi's framework treats istighfar as a return to a truer self-model, contingent, correctable, and oriented toward the real. Practically, istighfar works when it shifts attention, reduces threat, and produces repair behavior, an integrated form of emotional regulation. So the next time shame says, "You are the mistake," test a different proposition. I am the one who can return. In that sense, istighfar isn't denial of wrongdoing. It is the disciplined refusal to let wrongdoing define reality.